The Middle Ages were not an age of glory, as the songs of courtly minstrels often claim. They were an age of hunger, of cold winters and endless wars, of whispers carried by the wind and fears that clung to every shadow. The castles rose in stone, but their walls could not keep out the plagues that stalked the land. And where scripture failed to bring comfort, superstition crept in, filling the silence with tales of curses, demons, and men who were not men. Among these whispers, one name was carried through the centuries like a curse never lifted. The monks who dared to write it down never did so lightly, their quills trembling on the parchment as though the very act of recording it might summon the thing they described. They called him the Faceless Knight. A warrior who belonged neither to Christendom nor to the armies of heathens. A rider who bore no crest upon his shield and carried no banner into battle. He was not remembered for his victories but for his presence. An unnatural silence before the clash of steel, the withering of men who had not yet been touched by blade or spear. The chronicles say that wherever he appeared, crows blackened the skies. Not after the battle but before it. His coming was not heralded by trumpets but by wings. And when the fighting began, no shout or cry could drown out the sound of his horse's hooves, slow and deliberate, like the tolling of a funeral bell. There were those who claimed he was a ghost, born of the sins of the Crusades. Others whispered that he was a knight who had betrayed his order and been stripped not only of his honor but of his very humanity. Still others murmured darker things, that beneath his visor there was no flesh, no bone, only a hollow void, a black abyss that consumed the gaze of any who looked upon it. But whether demon, phantom, or cursed man, his existence was undeniable. Too many accounts appear in scattered manuscripts across Europe to be dismissed as the invention of frightened peasants. From the frozen forests of the north to the blood-soaked fields of Languedoc, scribes mention a rider cloaked in silence, clad in armor darkened by fire, his face forever hidden. The first record appears not in a chronicle of war, but in a prayer book from a monastery in Saxony. The monk writes of a rider who passed near their abbey during a storm, and how the bells rang by themselves in the tower, though no hand touched the ropes. He describes the sky turning black at midday, the sudden death of oxen in the fields, and the silence that fell upon the brethren as the rider disappeared into the woods. He bore no face, the monk wrote, and where his shadow touched no life endured. Another account, found in the margins of a knightly codex, tells of a tournament where a strange competitor entered the lists. He bore no colors, no herald, no page. His armor was battered and unadorned, his shield blank. The other knights mocked him until he unhorsed them one by one, not with force but with a kind of inevitability, as if their strength melted away before his lance touched them. When he was called to remove his helmet and reveal his name, he turned and left the field without a word. The chronicler writes that those who tried to follow him found only a trail of dead birds upon the ground, their wings still outstretched, their eyes glazed with terror. And yet, perhaps the most chilling testimony comes from a letter penned by a French soldier during the Albigensian Crusade. He describes a night attack upon a rebel fortress, where amid fire and chaos he glimpsed a lone figure moving through the flames. The others feared him though I knew not why, the soldier writes. I struck him with my sword and felt no resistance as though I had struck the air itself. Then he turned his gaze upon me, and I felt my heart wither inside my chest. I fled though I had never fled before and I have fled ever since. The letter ends abruptly. The soldier's name is not found in any muster roll after that night. It is easy to dismiss such tales as the inventions of frightened men, or the embellishments of storytellers. But why then do they appear in documents separated by language, distance, and century? Why do monks, knights, and peasants all describe the same figure, the same silence, the same faceless void beneath the visor? This is the burden of the forgotten chronicle, a story too dangerous to tell openly, too powerful to erase completely. It survives in fragments, in whispers, in the yellowed pages of libraries where dust has done its best to bury it. Yet every fragment points to the same truth. The faceless knight walked among men, and where he walked, death was never far behind. Tonight we open those forbidden pages. Tonight, we summon the echoes of a time when faith faltered, and shadows rode upon the earth. Tonight the legend begins. It was the year of our Lord 1241, when the sky itself seemed to betray the earth. A blood-red eclipse swallowed the sun, casting villages into a darkness that felt older than the world. The peasants trembled, for they knew eclipses were omens, and omens never brought blessings. In a small hamlet on the edge of the Black Forest, as wolves howled and cattle refused to eat, a child was born. The midwives whispered that his first cry never came. They slapped his back, prayed over him, even sprinkled holy water upon his skin, But the infant remained silent, his chest rising and falling without sound. His eyes, when they opened, were pools of black, as if the eclipse itself had taken root in them. His skin was pale as tallow, so translucent the veins beneath seemed like threads of ink. One of the women screamed that he was a changeling, a demon left by the forest spirits in exchange for a stolen soul. Another fainted outright. The priest who was summoned to baptize the child later wrote in his journal that as he raised the crucifix above the newborn, the flame of the candle guttered and died though no wind blew. I felt my hand grow numb, he confessed, and I wondered if I were blessing a soul or damning my own. The village, already ravaged by plague, saw no reason to keep the child. Some wanted to cast him into the river, others to abandon him in the woods. But in the end he was left at the gates of a monastery, swaddled in coarse wool, with nothing but the eclipse-marked day of his birth scratched onto a piece of wood. The monks, bound by vows of charity, took him in. They gave him no name, only a number in their records, as though even in infancy he was less a child than a burden of fate. Life within the monastery was harsh, but it was not without its small mercies: bread, water, a bed of straw. Yet wherever the boy walked, shadows seemed to lengthen. The brothers whispered that their candles dimmed when he passed. Cats hissed and hid from him, dogs whimpered, and the crows, those eternal heralds, often perched upon the cloister walls when he walked the courtyard, cawing as though greeting one of their own. At first the abbot dismissed such talk as superstition. But then came the day of the library fire. It began without warning, flames consuming manuscripts older than kingdoms. The monks tried desperately to douse the blaze, but every time the boy approached, the fire burned higher, leaping from shelf to shelf as though feeding upon his presence. Only when he was dragged outside into the rain did the flames finally subside. The abbot recorded in his ledger, "This child is not of God's house. He carries with him the ruin of knowledge." As the boy grew he spoke little. He learned to read scripture, yet showed no reverence for it. He joined the chants, yet his voice was flat, like an echo without origin. Some monks claimed they saw his reflection absent in water, others that his shadow stretched longer than it should. One swore before his death that he had seen the boy wandering the cloister at night, speaking to figures that dissolved when approached. When he reached the age of 12, a decision was made. The abbot declared that he must leave. The monastery could no longer bear the weight of his presence. They gave him a horse, a cloak, and a wooden crucifix, though some whispered it was not protection but a curse meant to bind him. He rode away without farewell, without question, without looking back. What became of him in the years that followed is lost to history. Some say he wandered as a mercenary, nameless and silent, fighting for coin yet never keeping it. Others believe he sought the old forests where druids once bled their sacrifices, searching for the source of the shadow within him. But wherever he went, the stories followed: cattle dying, wells turning foul, birds falling dead from the sky. And always, always, the silence of a rider who did not speak, did not smile, did not weep. Decades later, he would return to the world not as a nameless orphan, but as the figure who would come to be feared above kings and armies. The Faceless Knight was no sudden birth of legend. He was a seed sown in darkness, watered with silence, and destined to grow into a curse that even death itself could not contain. The eclipse that marked his birth was no mere accident of astronomy. It was the beginning of a shadow that would stretch across generations, a shadow that has not yet lifted. For when the sun hides, it is said his soul stirs, and when the moon bleeds red, his horse begins again to walk the earth. And so the chronicles marked the year not as the birth of a boy, but as the dawn of a curse. A curse that would wear armor, ride in silence, and erase the very faces of men. The Faceless Knight was born not of flesh but of omen. And omens, once loosed, never die. War was the heartbeat of the 13th century. From the frozen plains of the north to the burning sands of Outremer, steel clashed endlessly. Kings dreamed of thrones, popes dreamed of crusades, and peasants dreamed only of surviving another winter. It was in this furnace of blood and ambition that the Faceless Knight first revealed himself, not as a child cursed by whispers, but as a warrior whose very presence unbalanced the field of battle. The chronicles place his first true appearance in the year 1265, during a border war between two feuding lords in the Rhineland. It was a small conflict, insignificant in the grand tapestry of history, yet it birthed a terror that would haunt Europe for centuries. The field was shrouded in mist that morning, the kind of damp fog that clings to armor and makes even the bravest man feel alone. Both armies faced one another across a stretch of churned mud, banners hanging limp in the still air. The knights muttered prayers, the squires tightened straps, and the peasants, forced into service, tried not to think of death. But above the silence there came another sound, the cawing of crows. They circled in numbers far too great to be natural, blotting the gray sky with black wings. Soldiers crossed themselves nervously. The omen was clear. And then he came. Out of the mist rode a single figure. His armor was not gleaming like the polished steel of the nobles, but blackened, scarred, bearing the marks of fire and years. His shield bore no device, his surcoat no color, his lance no pennant. The horse beneath him was gaunt and restless, its eyes white with foam, yet it obeyed with unnatural precision. The rider's visor was down and it never lifted. He carried no banner, no squire rode at his side. He was a knight stripped of identity, stripped of allegiance. To whom did he belong? To no one. At first, both armies hesitated, thinking perhaps he was a scout or a deserter. But then he lowered his lance, and with the slow inevitability of a falling star, he charged. The first knight who dared to meet him reeled back before steel even touched steel, collapsing lifeless into the mud, his armor unpierced. Another rushed forward, only for his horse to throw him violently, eyes wide with terror as though it had seen something no mortal beast should see. Panic spread. Men whispered that the faceless rider carried death in his very presence, that his weapon was not steel but the void itself. Yet he did not stop. He moved through the battlefield like a shadow given form, his strikes few but devastating, not because they cleaved flesh but because they unraveled the will to fight. Entire groups broke and fled at the sight of him. Some threw down their weapons, others fell to their knees in prayer. The silence around him was unnatural. Amid the screams and clash of war, his approach brought only stillness as though the world itself held its breath. One chronicler, a monk who traveled with one of the armies, described it thus: I beheld him strike a man with the flat of his blade, and though no wound was made, the soldier withered like autumn leaves touched by frost. His eyes sank, his lips cracked, and he died without cry or struggle, as if centuries had passed through him in a moment. By midday both armies had scattered. The battle never truly began, for one rider ended it before the trumpets could sound. He did not raise his voice in victory, did not strip the fallen of their armor, did not seek coin or honor. He simply rode off into the mist, followed by the endless circling of crows. The lords, furious at the loss of their men, sought to deny his existence. They called it hysteria, a trick of the fog, the invention of cowards who abandoned the field. But the peasants knew. The squires who returned broken and pale knew. And the monks who wrote in their trembling hands knew. Something had walked among them that day which was not entirely of this earth. From that moment his legend spread like wildfire. He was not named, for no one knew his name. He was not claimed, for no lord wished to admit such a being had fought on his land. He was described only by absence, faceless, voiceless, without crest, without past. Tales traveled along trade routes, whispered in taverns, sung in fearful tones by wandering minstrels. Merchants in Cologne spoke of a knight who rode alone against 50 men and left none standing. Pilgrims on the road to Santiago told of seeing him pass silently, his horse's hooves never stirring dust. In Hungary, soldiers claimed he appeared at dawn, watched them for hours from a hilltop, and vanished without moving. And always the details remained the same: the crows, the silence, the faceless helm. It was said that to face him was to face your own death, not by blade or arrow but by inevitability. He did not conquer castles, nor did he claim lands. He was not a general, nor a mercenary seeking coin. He was something else, a force that drifted from battlefield to battlefield as if summoned by the smell of blood, or perhaps by something older that fed upon human war. One question haunted those who survived. What did he seek? If he fought for no lord, for no coin, for no cause, then why did he ride at all? Some whispered he was cursed to wander forever, that he sought death but could not find it. Others swore he was not seeking death but faces, each battle an endless hunt for a visage to replace the one he had lost. The truth lay hidden, perhaps even from the knight himself. But one thing was certain: the first battle was not his last. It was only the beginning of a trail of silence that would stretch across Europe, leaving behind nothing but fear, ruin, and whispers of a knight who was not a man, but a shadow riding in armor. And so the faceless knight stepped into history, not through parchment or oath, but through terror. His first battle was not won, it was endured, survived only by those quick enough to flee or lucky enough to be overlooked. And as the mists closed around him once more, the armies knew they had not fought against flesh, but against a void given form. The war ended, but the legend had just begun. In war, men crave certainty. They want names, banners, colors, and faces to define both friend and foe. But the faceless knight denied them all. He was an absence made flesh, a riddle on horseback. And it was this absence, more than his sword, that began to unravel the minds of those who beheld him. The chronicles diverge on the details, but all agree on one thing: no one ever saw his face. At first this was attributed to arrogance, a knight too proud to remove his helm. But as seasons passed, stories grew darker. Knights who fought beside him swore they heard nothing from him, not a word of command, not a grunt of exertion, not even the breath of a man inside armor. He was silent as stone, and yet he moved, struck, and killed with dreadful precision. Whispers began to circle. Perhaps there was no face beneath the visor at all. The first claim came from a mercenary in Lombardy who survived a skirmish against him. He insisted that in the clash the knight's visor was struck open. What he glimpsed was not flesh but void, an emptiness so complete that the world seemed to tilt toward it. He returned to camp blind, clawing his own eyes, raving that the darkness had followed him. By dawn he was dead. His fellows swore that his corpse bore no pupils, only black wells where his eyes had been. Another tale came from Spain, during a skirmish near Toledo. A Moorish archer loosed an arrow that struck the faceless knight's helm, splitting it slightly. For an instant, the visor cracked wide enough for those nearby to see. One soldier dropped to his knees, screaming that he saw his own face staring back at him from the void. Another claimed he saw a shifting mass of shadows, writhing and whispering. The archer who loosed the arrow was found days later, hanging from a tree by his own bowstring. No one dared cut him down. Even monks who were supposed to resist superstition could not avoid it. A Benedictine chronicler wrote, "Some say his visor hides nothing. Some say it hides everything. But all agree that what lies beneath is not for mortal eyes." This uncertainty became more terrifying than any sword. On the battlefield, men could brace themselves against pain, against wounds, even against death. But how could they steel themselves against the unknown? Against the possibility that a helm hid not a man but the abyss itself? Rumors spread like wildfire. In taverns, peasants whispered that he was not born but forged, an empty shell filled with shadow. Knights muttered that he had traded his face for immortality. Women crossing fields at dusk taught their children to look away if they ever saw a rider with no crest, lest the void beneath his helm steal their reflection. The silence of the night only fueled the dread. He never removed his armor in camp, never lifted his visor to eat or drink. Some swore he did not eat at all, nor sleep, nor bleed when cut. Blacksmiths claimed they once saw sparks fly from his wounds, as though steel clashed not with flesh but with iron. Others insisted he left no footprints where he walked, only the imprints of his horse. But the most disturbing tales were those of men who claimed the knight had turned his helm upon them directly. They spoke not of pain but of a withering, a draining of years. One said he felt his youth stripped away in seconds, leaving his hair gray and his teeth loose. Another insisted he lost all memory of his mother's face the instant the visor turned toward him, as though the knight stole it from his soul. These testimonies could not be proven, but they spread, and fear has no need of proof. The faceless knight became a weapon of terror, more devastating than fire or steel. Armies broke not because of his sword but because of his presence. Men fled rather than risk glimpsing what no mortal eye was meant to see. And yet, there were always the curious, the fools who wished to know the truth. Lords offered gold to any who could unmask him. None returned. One tale tells of a group of brigands who ambushed him in a forest, planning to overwhelm him with numbers. They never struck a blow. Days later, villagers found them scattered across the woods, their bodies untouched by blade but their faces gone. Skin smooth as wax, no eyes, no mouth, no nose, only blank flesh where identity had been. That night, the villagers swore they heard hoofbeats circling their homes until dawn. So the riddle endured, feeding itself. The faceless knight became less a man than a mirror of fear. Each witness saw something different beneath the visor, an abyss, a shifting shadow, their own face, or nothing at all. Perhaps the helm revealed not what was hidden, but what the soul most dreaded. And yet, if there was no face, then how could he be a man? If he was not a man, then what was he? By the end of the 13th century, even kings had heard his name spoken in fear. Some tried to recruit him, offering lands, wives, titles. He never replied. Others sent assassins, entire companies of them. None returned. One king, in despair, outlawed even the mention of him in his lands, as though silence could undo his existence. But silence was his domain, and it only made the dread grow. To see the faceless knight was to confront not death, but the void. And men will face death bravely, but the void? The void strips them of courage, of memory, of identity itself. The chronicles, when they dared to speak of him, called him not knight, not man, not ghost, but a shadow riding in steel. A riddle without an answer. A helm without a face. And so the legend deepened, not through deeds of conquest, but through the absence of a single human thing. A face. If the faceless knight was a curse, then where was the root of that curse planted? Some said it was in his birth beneath the blood-red eclipse. Others believed it was in the monastery that cast him out. But among the scattered fragments of old chronicles, there lies another story, a tale of a night deep within the woods, when a man ceased to be a man. The forest was no ordinary woodland. It was ancient, older than the kingdoms that squabbled for land, older than the faiths that raised their crosses and temples. The peasants called it the Black Grove. They swore that in its heart the old gods, those who had been banished by priests and kings, still lingered, hungry for worship, hungry for blood. Even in daylight, the trees bent unnaturally, their branches twisted like claws. At night, the silence was so heavy it pressed upon the chest, broken only by the occasional crack of unseen footsteps. Few dared to enter and fewer still returned. It was there, the legend claims, that the knight rode after leaving the monastery. He was a young man then, silent as ever, driven not by coin or duty but by something darker, perhaps a yearning to belong, or perhaps a pull he could not resist. 4 weeks he wandered, following trails of moss and roots, until he reached the heart of the Black Grove. What he found there has never been agreed upon. Some chronicles speak of a circle of standing stones, black with age, carved with runes no priest could read. Others describe an altar of rough stone, slick with offerings not yet dried. Still others whisper of a tree so vast its roots pierced the underworld, its trunk hollow with mouths that whispered in forgotten tongues. What is certain is this: there, in that place of shadows, he made a pact. One monk wrote, he gave his face for strength, his soul for silence, his rest for war. Another chronicler claimed he knelt before a figure of smoke and fire, neither man nor beast, and offered his flesh in exchange for victory eternal. Peasants, in their tales, spoke of him driving a blade into his own palm and letting the blood drip into the soil, where it was swallowed as though the earth itself drank it eagerly. When he rose, they say, his reflection was gone. He looked into pools of water and saw nothing. The crucifix he wore blackened and crumbled in his hand. And the crows, they gathered in hundreds, filling the trees, watching him with glassy eyes as though waiting for their new master. From that night forward, the knight was not merely silent. He was void. His face, whatever it had once been, was erased, replaced by absence. His body endured without aging, without rest, his wounds closing without scar. But the price was steep. He no longer belonged to man nor God. His name was stripped away, his lineage lost, his humanity devoured by the pact he had sealed in the grove. Witnesses told of strange signs in the years that followed. A farmer claimed he saw the knight standing among the trees, speaking to shadows that clung to him like servants. A shepherd swore he heard chanting in the forest at night, though no priests dwelt there, only the endless silhouettes of crows. A merchant traveling at dawn reported that he saw the knight sitting motionless before a stone altar, helm lifted, but when the merchant tried to glimpse his face, he fainted and awoke 3 days later, his beard white as snow. The Black Grove itself grew more dreaded after the pact. Entire villages abandoned their fields if the wind carried the sound of hoofbeats from that direction. No woodcutter would take an axe near its edge, no hunter would loose an arrow within its bounds. Those who dared spoke of bones half buried beneath the roots, not of animals but of men, faces smooth, blank, eyeless as though the earth had consumed their identities. The clergy of course called it heresy. Priests preached that the knight had bound himself to a demon, an emissary of hell. They urged kings to march into the forest, to burn it and banish whatever unholy power lingered there. But no army ever dared. When soldiers approached, their horses refused to advance. Torches sputtered and died. And always in the canopy above, the crows watched, countless and patient. It was from this pact that his curse took its true form. Before he had been feared as a silent warrior, uncanny but mortal. After he was something else entirely. His strikes drained not just life but essence. His visor revealed not flesh but the abyss. His very presence withered crops and silenced bells. He had become less a knight than a wound in the world, a tear between the realm of the living and whatever lay beyond. And yet, the pact was not only curse, it was compulsion. From that day on he was bound to the cycle of war. He could not live in peace, could not remain in solitude. He was drawn again and again to battlefields as if the pact demanded blood to be fed. Some said the shadows within his helm hungered, and only in war could they be sated. Others believed the knight himself was tormented, seeking in each clash the death that would never come. In the centuries since, fragments of this tale have survived but never in full. A burned manuscript in Prague bears only one line. He gave himself to the grove and the grove gave him nothing. A letter in Latin from a monk of Mainz records, we tried to bless him with holy water but the water boiled away. His face was not his own nor anyone's. A Norse saga, though far removed from the Rhineland, speaks of a faceless rider who came from the woods, bearing no name and left behind nothing but silence. The pact in the woods was not just the turning point of one man's fate, it was the birth of a myth that outlived generations. And though the grove itself has long since vanished into history, swallowed by centuries of storms and wars, the pact remains. For each time men go to battle, each time the crows gather before blood is shed, whispers return. He rides again. He rides from the woods. And somewhere in the silence between hoofbeats, the pact still whispers back. War spreads like fire, and where fire spreads, carrion follows. By the late 13th century, the faceless knight no longer wandered alone. At least not always. The earliest mention of his companions comes from a Cistercian monk writing in Burgundy, I beheld not one rider but many, their shapes half hidden by mist. They bore the likeness of men, yet their helms were hollow and their armor clattered without weight. They rode as if bound to him, shadows chained to his will. This was the birth of a new terror, the belief that the faceless knight commanded an army of shadows. At first, such claims were dismissed as hysteria. A single cursed knight was legend enough. To suggest that he rode with a host of revenants seemed impossible. Yet reports began to multiply. Entire companies swore they had seen spectral riders sweeping across battlefields in silence, striking down men without blade or touch. Soldiers fell where no wound could be found, their faces blank, smooth as wax, their eyes swallowed by darkness. One chronicler described the phenomenon in chilling detail. They came at dusk, a line of riders against the crimson sky. Their banners bore no crest, their voices no cry. Only the sound of hooves, steady as the heartbeat of the earth. When they passed, the air grew cold and the fallen did not bleed, they withered. Whether these riders were truly spirits or illusions born of terror, no one could say. Some claimed they were the souls of those who had gazed upon the knight's face, bound forever to serve him. Others believed they were shadows born from the pact in the Black Grove, extensions of his own cursed being. Whatever they were, their presence was undeniable. By the 1270s, entire armies fled at the mere rumor that the faceless knight approached. Villages abandoned their harvests if hoofbeats echoed in the distance. And kings began to dread not just the knight himself, but the procession that followed him. The descriptions are eerily consistent. Hollow helms with no eyes beneath, armor that bore no weight, voices that never spoke. Horses with ribs like cages, their breath misting even in summer, their hooves leaving no prints in the soil. And above them always the crows. Hundreds of them, circling like a storm as though the sky itself was rotting. A battle in Flanders illustrates the horror. Two lords faced each other with nearly 3,000 men combined. At dusk, before swords clashed, a hornless rider appeared on the horizon. Behind him, ranks upon ranks of mounted figures emerged from the fog, their armor glinting faintly though no torches burned. Panic erupted instantly. The first army broke and fled before contact. The second, thinking their foes bewitched, tried to stand their ground. They did not last an hour. Survivors reported that no blow struck them, no arrow pierced them, and yet their comrades fell all around, faces erased, eyes blackened, voices silenced forever. A French knight, one of the few who escaped, wrote in his will, I swear upon my soul that I beheld an army of the dead, and that they obeyed him as if he were king. Better to face the fires of hell than to ride against his host again. Even the Church, which dismissed so many superstitions as heresy, could not entirely deny these tales. A papal bull issued in 1282 warned soldiers against the armies of the void, led by the faceless rider. Though couched in the language of allegory, it revealed the fear had reached Rome itself. Priests began to preach that the knight had become an antichrist figure, gathering the souls of the damned into his host. Others offered a darker interpretation. They believed the army was not of spirits at all, but of men who had surrendered their faces willingly. Mercenaries, desperate for strength, outlaws cast from society, peasants who bargained in the Black Grove, each giving up their visage, their humanity in exchange for power. If this were true, then the faceless host was not just a curse, but a cult, growing with every passing war. Whatever the truth, the terror of the faceless army reshaped the way wars were fought. Scouts refused to approach forests at night. Villages barricaded their windows if they heard hoofbeats. Some lords even abandoned campaigns entirely upon hearing rumors that the night was near. And yet there were those who sought him still. Kings, driven by desperation, sent envoys to bargain with the faceless rider. None returned. A German chronicle claims one envoy's horse returned without rider, its saddle soaked in blood though the animal bore no wound. Another tale speaks of an English baron who offered 1,000 men to join the faceless host. His lands were found abandoned months later, the peasants vanished, the fields choked with crows. The faceless knight himself remained unchanged. He never spoke, never claimed victory, never raised a banner. He was not a conqueror. He was a shadow, and shadows claim not thrones but silence. His army, if army it truly was, did not build castles or hold ground. They came, they rode, they vanished. Yet the silence they left behind was more devastating than fire. For war is built upon memory, songs of valor, names of the fallen, victories carved into stone. But where the faceless knight and his host rode, memory itself seemed to wither. No names were recorded, no heroes sung. Only silence. A chronicler in Florence summarized it in one chilling line: "He does not kill men, he erases them." And so the legend of the army of shadows spread, not as tale of conquest, but as a wound in history itself. A force that fought without purpose, without end, without humanity. A host of hollow men led by the void at their center. And though centuries have passed, still the whispers linger. When many crows gather before battle, when riders are seen at dusk with no faces, when silence falls too suddenly over the earth, it is not men who ride, but shadows. And always at their head the faceless knight. Every curse has an ending, or so men hope. For decades, the faceless knight had wandered battlefields, a shadow among shadows, his legend growing darker with each passing war. But then, as suddenly as he had come, the chronicles record a final confrontation. A moment when kings, priests, and warriors alike believed the curse would at last be broken. It was the spring of 1291, a year already thick with omens. Across Europe, the ground shook with strange tremors. Comets lit the night sky. Crops withered without reason. And always the crows gathered, their cries echoing like a dirge. Some said the earth itself was weary of war. Others whispered that the faceless knight had grown too strong, that his presence alone was unraveling the fabric of creation. The story begins at Montségur, the fortress of the Cathar heretics in the Languedoc. The church had decreed their extermination, and armies marched to burn them alive. But hidden among the chronicles of that siege is a fragment, scrawled in the margins by a terrified scribe. He came to Montségur, and the shadows came with him. Witnesses claimed the faceless knight stood upon a hill overlooking the fortress as the flames consumed it. His helm reflected the fire, yet revealed nothing. Some swore the heretics prayed not to Christ, but to him, as though his silence offered more mercy than the swords of the Crusaders. When the fortress fell, he rode down into the ashes, and the survivors screamed not at the soldiers, but at the rider who bore no face. From that day he vanished from smaller skirmishes. He no longer haunted border wars or mercenary battles. Instead he was seen only at great clashes, where thousands fought and thousands died. As if the hunger of his curse had grown, demanding more and more lives to feed the void. The climax came years later, at a battlefield whose name is lost to history. Some call it the Black Plain, others the Field of Crows. What is certain is that it was a war meant to end wars, an alliance of kings and lords, uniting not against each other but against him. For once, enemies set aside their blood feuds. A pope's banner flew beside pagan standards. Knights of Christ rode beside mercenaries and outlaws. It was said that even heretics were pardoned, so long as they raised their swords against the faceless rider. They believed sheer numbers, sheer faith, sheer desperation could destroy him. The armies gathered, tens of thousands strong, their banners a sea of color against the gray sky. Priests marched with them, bearing relics and crosses. They sang hymns so loud they shook the air. Bells were carted from churches to ring upon the field, drowning out the crows. And then, silence. The hymns faltered. The bells cracked. The crows descended in swarms, blotting out the sun. And through the cloud of wings he rode, alone as he always had. The faceless knight. His host followed, not of men but of shadows, hundreds of riders hollow and voiceless, their helms reflecting nothing, their hooves making no sound. The clash was not battle but apocalypse. Arrows darkened the sky, but none struck him. Spears splintered against his armor as though they struck smoke. Entire ranks collapsed before his host even reached them, their faces erased, their bodies intact. Priests lifted relics, but the relics blackened and cracked in their hands. Kings shouted commands but their voices withered into whispers. One chronicler writes, "It was as though we fought not an enemy but silence itself. A silence that devoured hymns, that drank screams, that left only the sound of hoofbeats. Men fled but the field was surrounded by mist. They ran into it and never returned. Horses threw their riders and bolted, only to vanish into the fog. Those who dared to face him directly met fates worse than death. One knight struck the faceless knight with a blessed sword. The blade shattered and the knight's body turned to ash. Another tried to unhorse him only to seize the visor, and scream as his own face was pulled into the helm, leaving him faceless, falling lifeless into the mud. The chronicles cannot agree on how it ended. Some say the faceless knight triumphed utterly, that no man survived but the chroniclers who fled in shame. Others whisper that the priest succeeded in binding him, chaining him with words not found in scripture, sealing him in a crypt beneath the black forest. Still others believe he was consumed by his own host, swallowed by the shadows he commanded, leaving nothing but his horse's hoofprints burned into the earth. But what all accounts agree upon is this: his body was never found. No helm, no sword, no bones. The battlefield was stripped of all corpses as though the earth itself had devoured them. Only silence remained and the crows, so many crows the sky was black for days. The kings returned to their lands broken, their armies decimated, their banners burned. The priests called it victory, claiming the knight had been cast into hell. But the survivors knew better. They had not seen a defeat, only a disappearance. Pause. 4 curses do not die. They sleep. And so the last battle was not an end but an interlude. A silence before the hoofbeats return. And even now, centuries later, when travelers hear the rhythm of a lone horse in the fog, when they see crows gathering before a storm, they remember the field of shadows. They remember the faceless rider. And they whisper, the battle never ended. He still rides. The chronicles end but the legend does not. For while the scribes dared not write further, the whispers have never ceased. Centuries have passed since the last battle, and kingdoms have risen and fallen into dust. Cannons have replaced swords, and cities of stone now pierce the skies where once forests ruled. And yet, in the lonely places of the earth, the shadow of the faceless knight lingers still. Travelers tell the tales first. A merchant in Bavaria, returning from market, spoke of hearing hoofbeats in the fog though no horse approached. He swore the sound followed him for miles, never closer, never farther, until he reached the gates of his town, where the guards found his hair turned white as snow. He lived only 3 days more, speaking of a helm without a face. A shepherd in the Pyrenees claimed to see a rider at dusk, motionless upon a hill. The rider never moved, never breathed, never shifted, but when the shepherd looked away and back again, the hill was empty, and every one of his sheep lay dead, their faces smooth and blank as wax. A fisherman on the coast of Ireland returned to shore in terror, swearing that in the mists beyond the waves he saw a line of riders moving silently across the water, their armor gleaming faintly under the moon. He threw away his nets and never sailed again. Skeptics laugh, of course. They call these stories the inventions of fearful men, echoes of medieval superstition. But the laughter fades when they hear the same story repeated across nations, across centuries, in places where no common tongue or culture should bind them. Always the same marks, the silence, the crows, the hoofbeats in the dark. Always the same terror, the faceless knight still rides. Some believe he is cursed to wander until the world ends, drawn not to lands or thrones but to war itself. Where men spill blood he comes. Where banners clash his shadow gathers. In this telling the faceless knight is eternal, the patron saint of slaughter. Each generation has its battles, and in each he walks unseen among the ranks, waiting for eyes to fall upon his visor so he may claim another soul. Others whisper a darker thought, that he has no need of war anymore. That he rides not to armies but to the lonely, the weak, the forgotten. A farmer walking home at dusk. A pilgrim crossing an abandoned road. A soldier who survived too many battles and now finds a rider waiting outside his door. In this telling the curse has spread, seeking not just blood but faces one by one, until the earth itself wears no visage. The church still denies him, though relics are kept in silence. A cracked sword said to have struck him, a blank mask said to have belonged to one of his host. These are locked away in vaults beneath cathedrals, hidden from the faithful, lest the truth undo the illusion of order. Scholars write of him in footnotes, always careful to call him legend or myth, but their eyes betray the fear that perhaps he was and is real. And there are those who worship him. Secret cults in forests, descendants of the Black Grove, still gather beneath eclipses to offer blood to the faceless rider. They chant that he will return to lead the final war, when the earth is swallowed in shadow and the sun dies. They carve their own faces away in imitation, leaving only smooth flesh, blank as the waxen dead of old. But perhaps the most chilling truth is this: the faceless knight needs no cult, no chroniclers, no priests. He survives in memory, and memory is enough. Every time a soldier hears hoofbeats in the fog, every time a child sees crows gathering on a roof, every time a traveler feels watched on an empty road, the legend awakens again. And legends, once awakened, never sleep. Even in the modern age, with iron trains and burning cities, whispers persist. Soldiers in the Great War wrote of hearing hoofbeats in no man's land, though no horses remained on the front. Survivors of bombed villages in the Second War spoke of a rider moving through the smoke, his visor reflecting the flames. And still today, travelers on lonely highways swear they glimpse a shadow on horseback in their mirrors, keeping pace just beyond the headlights. It is said that he cannot die, for he was never truly alive. He cannot rest, for his soul was traded long ago. He cannot be remembered, for he erases faces, names and voices. He is a void, and voids cannot end. They only expand. So if ever you walk alone and hear the sound of hooves upon stone, though no horse is near, if ever you see crows gathered in numbers too great for chance, if ever silence falls too heavy, too sudden, upon the earth, know that you are not alone. Know that the pact in the Black Grove still whispers. Know that the faceless rider still hunts. And pray, pray that he does not turn his helm upon you. For in that instant your reflection will vanish, your voice will falter, your face will be gone. And you will ride with him, voiceless, faceless, nameless, forever. The chronicles have ended. The armies are dust. The castles are ruins. But the curse rides on. The faceless knight is not history. He is the echo in the dark.